Scene 3 of Streetcar is the poker night scene. It's a very famous one. It's one that a lot of students say a lot about, so we'll try and sort of stick to the elements that maybe people haven't spoken about quite so much. The first thing to notice, obviously, the first, top of the stage direction on scene 3, it says the poker night. And remember, that was one of William's early choices for a name for this play, so it's a crucial scene. And remember as well that there's a poker night at the end of the play as well. When Blanche is led off, the men are still playing poker. So one interpretation of that is that the world of New Orleans hasn't changed, so nobody's really touched by Blanche's tragedy. Another way of looking at it, if you're more sympathetic to Blanche and want to see her sort of having a bit more of a victory, is that New Orleans is this big circle. I mentioned Stella's baby. Stella sort of echoes Stephen Eunice, which I've touched on before, and we'll come on to a bit later as well. So actually you could argue that this shows actually that things in New Orleans aren't changing, so at least Blanche has kind of escaped it. Williams talks about this picture of Van Gogh's, this billiard parlour at night, and the bright colours of that, and that's what this scene is all about. That's what he's trying to set up with the bright primary colours worn by Stanley and his friends. Again, it's setting them very much in that real, literal world, the neon lights of New Orleans compared to Blanche's white delicacy. That's emphasised later on when Blanche obviously needs the lantern put on the light bulb because she can't cope with the naked white light. So again, those two through the stage directions, through the light and setup, has been very, very much opposed. We get Mitch on top of page 28 mentioning his sick mother. I've got a sick mother, she don't go to sleep until I come in at night. That's seen as Mitch's sort of more sensitive side. I guess you could also argue this sort of foreshadows though the problem with Mitch and Blanche's relationship. Part of the Southern Gothic tradition was this ideal of the Southern gentleman. If you've seen something like Gone with the Wind, that's the perfect ideal image. This very masculine figure, but who is also very sensitive and who is also this kind of romantic hero. The issue that we seem to have in New Orleans is that Blanche can never find that. The men are either like Stanley and sexually attractive, but actually not in any way sensitive, or like Mitch and the Doctor, very, very sensitive to women, but only to women like their mother, or the Doctor's, treating a patient, as Blanche becomes. They're only sensitive to women who, they're in no way romantically linked to, and that seems to be the problem with the New World. So I think already here Williams is maybe making a comment on that Southern gentleman idea is dead. Hence why Blanche pursues young men, because they're not formed yet into that kind of into that trap. Blanche says, top of page 29, or about a third of the way down, please don't get up. Stanley says, nobody's going to get up, so don't be worried. Of course, at the end of the play, the men all do stand up for Blanche. So again, there's a possibility of seeing this play really of Blanche's purgatory, but actually that at the end she does rise up. Again, people are rising around her as Stella's sort of coming down the fire escape, down off the columns. That sense that perhaps Blanche has achieved some sort of victory at the end. Blanche has a third of the way down page 30. That one seems superior to the others about Mitch. Possibly, but I think Williams is also setting up, the awkward courtesy that we get from Mitch. That actually he isn't really, he is a slightly different character, but he's still not on Blanche's wavelength. We see towards the bottom of page 30, Stella says Stanley's the only one of his crowd that's likely to get anywhere. Again, we see that sense, don't we, that in this world that values certain qualities, actually it's Stanley who is always going to succeed. And it's a comment, I think, again, on the world as William sees it, the new America, the literal world, the American dream, the focus on having stuff, which is very much where Stanley is, where there's no place for romance or for stories. We get the battle over the radio on page 31, about halfway down. Blanche turns it on and Stanley wants to turn it off. Again, it's a literal item, isn't it? Radios were plastic, sort of starting to be mass-produced at this point, a real mark of Stanley's status. Of course, Blanche sees it for the music, Stanley sees it as a mark of his status. So even on this, Williams is setting up how one small image can be seen very, very differently, and it becomes this battle again between Stanley and Blanche. What we get on page 33, Mitch talks about this inscription that he's got, and Mitch tells Blanche the girl's dead now, and Blanche says, oh, and that seems to be the moment where we get a real emotion from Blanche. Everything else is quite artificial, but Williams puts the stage direction here in a tone of deep sympathy. Again, it's the story, it's the loss, it's the grief that touches Blanche. It's the idea of Mitch, it's the love story of Mitch that Williams shows that appeals to her, rather than the reality of a quite clumsy guy. And he says halfway down page 33, Blanche says, sorrow makes for sincerity, I think. Mitch says it sure brings it out in people. Again, Williams is at pains here to suggest that Blanche is sincere for all of her lies, that actually there's a sincerity there. And of course, with Mitch saying that, we see at the end, he has his head down through guilt, and that sorrow has sort of created that. Blanche explains her name, top of page 34, White Woods, again, of course, White being linked with Blanche and Stella's past, this Southern Gothic ideal, that has now kind of been destroyed, really. Blanche is halfway down page 34, I can't stand a naked light bulb any more than a kind of rude remark or a vulgar action. Of course, this is that image of Mitch putting the lantern on the light bulb and then ripping it off at the end. But look at what she compares it to, the rude remarks, the vulgar action. Again, it's that Southern gentility idea, the idea of correct manners, which was this perfect Southern gentleman. We get this idea that Blanche needs artifice because she's trying to recreate this ideal that hasn't been allowed to exist anymore. It's been taken over by men like Stanley. Top of page 35, Blanche mentions Edgar Allan Poe again. She talks about trying to essentially instill drugstore Romeos with reference for Hawthorne and Whitman and Poe. Again, that's a bit of a microcosm of this scene, isn't it? It's Blanche trying to portray a sort of Southern Gothic love story onto Mitch, and actually he's a drugstore Romeo. He's a very flawed character, and so I think that irony is there. Williams is inviting us almost to laugh at that irony. But only if we get what Poe is, only if we get the literature. We have to be on Blanche's side to start to laugh here. So I think there's that move that Williams is sort of manipulating the audience to maybe follow Blanche more even from here. Blanche says a little bit below that, it's touching to notice them making their first discovery of love. Again, we get that idea that Blanche's fascination with young men is, although it's got her sacked, it's really about trying to recreate this Southern ideal, this ideal situation where a man can be both gentlemanly and romantic, that Blanche hasn't been able to see. Notice on page 36 when Stanley has hit Stella, and like I say, I'm skipping over that bit because it's a bit that people talk about a lot. The men are described about a third of the way down page 36. They speak quietly and lovingly to him, and he leans his face on one of their shoulders. Really bizarrely, that's where the word loving is used in relation to all these men, and it's about Stanley. And I guess Williams is implying here that what is Blanche's ideal of the ideal man has now been almost replaced, and the loving behaviour of these kinds of men is actually directed to their leader, to a man who represents that American dream, that idea of what a man should be in this world. That seems to be what's replaced it, and Williams has put that in there to suggest there's no place for real romance now. This is all that's left. Of course, then we get Stanley crying that Stella's left him. He calls Eunice on the phone, so halfway down page 37, Eunice, I want my baby. There's an irony there, and I'll come to it later on, but Stanley and Stella and Steve and Eunice seem to be set up as quite similar throughout the play, and at the end it's Eunice comforting Stella. There's a reference in the play about Eunice being hit by Steve. They hear a crashing sound, and Stanley saying, oh, those two are crazy about each other. There's a real similarity there, and again it's that circularity of life in New Orleans. Notice also Stanley's on the phone, and he doesn't get an answer. Just like Blanche at the end of the play calls Shep Huntley, doesn't get an answer. It's not a real phone call. So we get these two fake or misheard phone calls, sort of sandwiching a lot of stuff in the middle as well. Eunice says top of 38, I hope they do haul you in and turn the fire hose on you, same as last time. Again, it's that water image, that idea that the water is, I guess, essentially, represents Blanche's dreams, Blanche's imagination, and here it's something that can finally calm Stanley a little bit. We get the low animal moans from Stanley and Stella. There's a reference to Stella's belly curving a little with maternity, so again this idea that actually this is a bit of a circle, this is a pattern that's going to repeat itself through Stella's child as well. Mitch says they're crazy about each other, bottom of page 38, very similar to the language that's used for Steve and Eunice. And then at the end of the play, Blanche says there's so much confusion in the world thank you for being so kind, I need kindness now. Of course, at the very end of the play, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. Those two lines are linked as well. And actually, there's an irony here that's Mitch and the Doctor sort of represent the same thing. They're not romantic interests, are they? They are people who offer kindness, but it's a kindness that comes from benevolence rather than romance, through for looking after somebody. So scene 3 really seems to be about foreshadowing things that come back later on. This sense of New Orleans being a circle, and the scenes between now and the end kind of being encompassed in these two sort of bookends really. So I've tried to get away from some of the more obvious stuff, the crying of Stella coming down the fire escape steps, and look at things maybe that other people wouldn't have done.